If you'd come here 5 years ago, you would have found 3 children whom I brought up by myself after my wife died 20 years ago. And this was their nursery where they watched television and had all their toys. Now I'm alone here. The children have grown up. So in a way, this is my nursery. There's even an exercise bicycle, which sadly to say, it has the lowest mileage of any exercise bicycle in London. This is where I come in the evenings, but where my real existence as a writer is in this room here. This is where my imagination dwells. This is my study, and it's always been my private room. It's at that desk where I've written my fiction for the last, I think, almost every novel I've written and almost all my entire output of fiction has been written in sitting at that desk, looking out on that little garden. I didn't feel in the 1950s that the English landscape was one I could write about. English society struck me as extremely uninteresting in every respect, class-ridden, obsessed with nostalgia for a vanished empire. I was very aware when I came to England in 1946 that the light here was different. It was much darker. It was much grayer. That it was a puritanical country where people were led extremely rigid and closed lives, and everybody knew his place on the social ladder. And the kind of fiction, the novels that were being written, were all about the English class structure. They were all about little nuances of social distinctions, which the English were obsessed with, and to some extent still are. I wanted a fiction, but I wanted to write a kind of fiction that broke away from this very old-fashioned, looking backward sort of fiction. I wanted a fiction that was about, never mind the future, but was about the present day. It seemed to me that English fiction wasn't even about the present day. And the 50s, it seemed to me, were a time of enormous change. The world we live in now, the world of international jet travel, package holidays, computers, installment buying, the whole communications landscape that we inhabit, dominated by television, mass advertising, politics conducted as a branch of advertising. All this was being created in the 1950s. The rails were being laid down, along which Western Europe would run in the next 20 or 30 years. I wanted to write about this. I wanted to write about change and possibility. I wanted to write about the next 5 minutes, not the last 30 years. And the only form of fiction that it seemed to me that had the vocabulary of ideas to deal with the next 5 minutes was science fiction. Now, I wasn't interested in interplanetary travel, time travel, outer space. That didn't interest me at all, and I've never written a science fiction set in outer space or millions of years in the future. I wanted a science fiction for the present day. It seemed to me when I started writing in the late 50s and early 60s that the future was a better key to the present than the past. And one had to look at the next 5 minutes to understand what was going on now. I'd like to think that I worked in the area of myths, dreams, legends, which seem to me to touch the real nature of our experience, both as private individuals with our own private dreams and as members of a society. And societies have their dreams too. In fact, what is so strange about the world we inhabit today is the way in which fiction and reality have become reversed. That, say 20, 30, 40 years ago, everybody had a clear idea of the world of reality was the external world around you, the world of work and industry, commerce. The world of fantasy And the imagination was the world inside our heads, our private dreams and hopes for the future and so on. Now that's been reversed. Now we're living in a world that is almost, the external landscapes of our world are almost entirely fictional, made up of advertising and publicity, an artificial man-made landscape. The only point of reality we each of us have is the point of reality inside our heads. Our own obsessions are all we have. It seems to me that the sort of world we live in needs a certain amount of oil to make the wheels go round. In the 60s, sex provided that role. Now, in our landscape, sex is no longer a new frontier. You get the impression almost that sex has died out, or doesn't take place anymore. Certainly, the landscape, the media landscape that we inhabit, this enormous novel we're living inside, thrives on sensation. It needs sensation to sustain itself. We're rather in the position of a sort of drowsing animal drugged by some powerful narcotic agent who needs electric shocks to keep it awake. And the electric shocks are provided by violence today, by violent imagery of one sort or another, whether it's plane crashes or train crashes, hijacks or just car crashes from our local city streets. It seems to me that what most of us have to fear for the future is not that something terrible is going to happen, but rather that nothing is going to happen, that we may live, or my children may well live, in a boring world, in what I would call an eventless world, a world where nothing happens. And this will lead, this is what I fear will happen, is that this will lead to the atrophy of the imagination. I felt this very strongly, oddly enough, some years ago when I was taken on a long drive through West Germany. And it struck me that here was this immaculate country of beautiful, clean streets and houses where every driveway had a BMW. And even a drifting leaf in the street looked as if it had too much freedom. I felt that this might be, if you want an image of what the future is going to look like, it will be a suburb of Dusseldorf. And that might not be a good thing for the human spirit. One sees that coming over here a bit. If the imagination dies, then it may be that, of course, the only area in which the imagination will continue to live will be in the area of psychopathology. That psychopathology may become the last repository of the human imagination. In one of my books, The Atrocity Exhibition, I even make the suggestion that psychopathology should be kept alive as the last reservoir, like a nature reserve in Africa, the last reservoir of the human imagination. There's no doubt that the surrealist painters have had a far bigger influence on me than any writers have done. I regard surrealism as really the greatest imaginative adventure of the 20th century. I think the surrealist movement is very misunderstood. People think it's a movement in painting inspired by fantasy, but in fact that's not true. The surrealists were all very interested in science, in optics and photography, and their main inspiration, of course, was psychoanalysis. And I think that combination of science and the imagination is very close to my own writing, and of course it has many affinities with science fiction itself. In many ways, I believe that science fiction is the authentic literature of the 20th century. I think it's unfortunate that science fiction is boxed off into its own little compartment. It seems to me a little ironic that I've had, after something like nearly 30 years as a writer, my first real success has been with a book that isn't science fiction, that is more straightforwardly even autobiographical. I mean, I can see the irony of that, but I've always been fairly philosophical about these things, and so it doesn't, worry me in a way.
The success with this book, has it changed your life in any way?
No, it hasn't. I wish it had. I wish I'd done something like buy a nightclub or run off with a teenage girl. No, my life has not changed at all. And in a way, that worries me. It should change, and it shows all the signs of going on exactly as before. But, of course, these things take a long time to work through the system, and it may be that my life has changed, but I haven't noticed it yet.
If your life is exactly as before, how is it then?
My life? Well, I lead an extremely quiet life. I live about 20 miles to the west of London in a small suburb. Now that my children have grown up and left home, I write during the day, go for a walk along the river in the early evening, and then watch TV and drink whiskey and soda. And that seems to be the right background for me as an imaginative writer. Perhaps I need an almost invisible surroundings, and this suburb is almost invisible to me. In fact, I went on holiday a few years ago to Greece, and I was there for about a month, and I was standing on a beach in the Peloponnese, and I suddenly forgot where I lived. I couldn't remember. I knew I lived in England, but I couldn't remember where, even though I lived then in this house for about 20 years, and I actually had to work it out backwards, Calais, Dover, London, Hammersmith, Shepperton, I suddenly realized, and then this house. So obviously this house on this quiet suburb where I worked doesn't have a real grip on my imagination. I think its great appeal for me is that it is nowhere, that it represents the minimal context in which I can sort of credibly feel part of a landscape. But it's not one from which I draw anything, imaginatively speaking. In many ways, I feel like a sort of secret agent who assumes a modest disguise, pretends to be a bank clerk living in a suburb. And I feel that to a large extent, I'm probably doing that. I like to think of myself a bit like the surrealist painter Magritte, who led a very bourgeois life in a quiet suburb of Brussels, took his Pomeranian dog for a walk at the same time every afternoon, drank a little coffee in the local cafe and played a game of chess, and then went back to this very bourgeois house. I like that. I think that's the perfect background for certain kinds of imagination.